Hi, everybody. I'm Jeff Weiss, co-chair of Steptoe's International Trade Policy Practice and lead of the firm's supply chain team. Welcome to Supply Chain University, where we dive into the legal, policy, and advocacy issues involving supply chains. To find out more, visit our website at steptoe.com. On this episode, we're talking with Eugene Laney, the president and CEO of AAEI, the American Association of Exporters and Importers. Eugene, thanks so much for joining us. We're really excited to have you here at Supply Chain University.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Looking forward to the conversation.
And I'm also joined by my Steptoe colleague, Stephanie Wang, who focuses her practice on international trade and investment and international regulation and compliance, and is also very active in AAEI. So welcome, Stephanie.
Thanks, Jeff. Glad to be here as well.
So Eugene, can you tell our viewers a little bit about AAEI and who you represent and the association's mission and key priorities?
Sure. So the American Association of Exporters and Importers was founded 100 years ago. It was back in 1921, and at our first conference, President Harding was a part of participating in our conference. And if you think about back in 1921, it's similar to what we're living through today, where back then you had the tail end of the flu epidemic, pandemic. You had, a lot of political divisions in Europe. You had emerging sort of superpower in China. Tail end of the World War One. So we have sort of those same issues today that we're dealing with. How to reignite international trade. And so our membership, we represent about 200 to 250 multinational corporations, anywhere from a mom and pop a trader to a large, major corporation that's been an AEI member for 50 plus years. We also have about 20% of our membership are small and medium-sized businesses, mainly those companies that are selling services to your major companies that are trading across the globe. And so when you look at AEI and our major issues, what's keeping us up right now is sort of what was keeping us up back in 1921, and that's supply chain disruptions, port congestion, how to, create, improve trade facilitation. And then, of course, you have a lot of the consumer product safety concerns that the government has, mainly for us is around forced labor. And then, of course, we have, FDA issues and other issues. So right now, our main issues is try to figure out a way to improve trade facilitation, to get trade back moving again. Of course, trade was shut down, through COVID. We want to get it back moving, in a cost-effective way and an efficient way.
So let's talk about trade facilitation first. And obviously, this is a time of, great, congestion at ports in particular. I think last I checked last week, there were almost 60 ships waiting to unload outside of LA and Long Beach. It's probably grown since then. What are you hearing from your members on the state of the supply chain right now?
Yeah, Jeff, we get calls every day, calls and emails every day from what I would call sort of unusual suspects. These are not your normal traders who are calling and they're upset. They're seeing their costs going up. They're seeing their delivery times going up. And so it's enormous concern of whether they can meet their obligations to that final consumer or to, whoever they're supplying goods at. And so it's not even just in we talk a lot about what's going on the West Coast, but we see that same strain occurring in places, in air hubs in Memphis and in Cincinnati and others, where everyone is trying to figure out how to accommodate this, this pent up, demand. And so there's the certainty that you once had within the supply chain, certainty around cost, certainty around delivery has now been removed, and you're at a point now where you're trying to figure out alternative ways to get your product delivered. We see a lot of people now moving towards overcapacity, the idea that they're overloading their warehouses because they don't know when the next black swan is going to come. We've had black swans are now becoming more frequent, whether it's COVID, right, whether it's a hurricane, earthquake, political disruption, the Suez Canal. So, more companies are looking for ways to, build up greater capacity and also alternative ways to get their goods here, whether they're moving from, ocean containers to air, or are they just, contracting their own ocean containers to figure out, medium and small size ports to deliver their goods. So it's a true crisis, at the port, and it's impacting pricing. Prices are going up because, if you want to go out there to buy a car, the car isn't there, so the auto dealer can, raise the price on that. If you want to buy a new television, the television isn't there, so they can raise the prices on it. So we're definitely seeing it have an impact on consumers.
Yeah, we're going to be waiting for a new dishwasher for a while. But even worse, we were at a restaurant the other day where my son really likes waffles. It's one of the only things he eats right now. And the waffle maker was broken, and the spare part is on back order.
Yeah.
And he was extremely upset. So now this is really impacting my life.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, no, Jeff, I can totally, the doctor told me I had to become a pescatarian. And that would have been easy 2 years ago, but now you can't get access to fish. So when I go out to eat, there's a supply chain disruptions around the supply of fish. Fish is being held up in Maine somewhere now, so I can't get a fish deal. So now I'm officially a vegetarian.
So what are some of the things that y'all at AAEI are doing to try to address some of these issues?
Yeah, so the one big thing is the 21 CCF. So that's the sort of modernizing the U.S. Customs. And so if you look at U.S. Customs is sort of the leader globally, is sort of creating new best practices and standards. And so CBP basically took a step back and said, okay, we want to look at what are we doing right, what are we doing wrong, what do we need to continue, and what is out there that's keeping us up at night. It's sort of the stop, start, continue exercise, and then looking forward to the future. And so AEI is aggressively working with Customs to sort of look at these different buckets. We stood up a 21 CCF committee led by Stephanie to really look at how can we reshape Customs around being more forward-thinking, not so much focusing on the ills of today, whether it's forced labor or terrorism or counterfeit and those types of things, but what might be coming down the road as far as AEI, AI, blockchain, those types of things. The other things we're really working on to create metrics and measurements. So the government is very good at having, these study groups or advisory panels, and they come out with recommendations, but sometimes there are not any metrics or measurements attached to that, so they don't really know how well they're performing. And for us, we as supply chain managers, performance matters. How we're measured matters. The velocity of the supply chain is important. So it's important that we teach Customs or help Customs provide metrics and measurements around the regulations that they're putting forward. And then the third big piece is the idea that we recognize that there are unusual suspects in the trade, supply chain, whether it's a mom and pop e-commerce company or someone one-off shipping something or supplying something. But we also recognize that they're trusted traders. So these are, your companies that have been trading the same supply routes for the last 50 plus years. These are companies that CBP knows where they're coming from. They know the products. These are even companies that have received defense contractor certifications. So you can imagine if you've been certified by the Department of Defense as a trusted trader, but CBP doesn't recognize you as a trusted trader. So there's sort of a conflict there in the sense that one agency recognizes you as trusted. They've certified your supply chain to supply goods to the military. But on the other side of that, they still don't view you as trusted. So we need to get more to a one government approach, and that's looking at who is trusted out there.
Right. So it sounds like there's a major coordination issue going on there.
Definitely.
Yeah. And you mentioned that Stephanie's leading the work on the 21 CCF committee. And Stephanie, I'm wondering whether you could speak a bit about the work you're doing in AAEI's efforts in that area.
Sure. So we have this 21 CCF subcommittee, which brings members together who are interested as to what they are looking for as Customs embarks on this vast reimagining of how that trade system works. They are hoping to be broad in their changes and to address the future. They are looking at new technologies and trying to get more visibility in their supply chains and make both enforcement and facilitation improvements. And AAEI members have been very interested on this issue and want to make certain that it addresses a lot of the problems they are facing and also are reasonable and make sense from a business perspective. And I think what I've found talking to AAEI members who are very knowledgeable about these issues and have a lot of technical expertise is what often happens when you have only CBP handling these issues as opposed to engagement with trade. You often, have ideas which sound good, but maybe in practice do not work so well. And I think that's where AAEI and the subcommittee are trying to do their best to kind of show Customs what would work, what would not work, what makes sense and what does not make sense in a business context. I think Customs has talked a lot about gathering a lot of information sooner and earlier, and I think our members, AAEI's members, have been really thinking about what information is necessary for Customs to do its work in terms of enforcement, and what is necessary, and what makes sense. And as Eugene mentioned, AAEI is comprised of businesses of all different sizes, right? So any sort of change or evolution of the system needs to also take into account the different sort of players who are using it and make sense, whether or not it's a Fortune 500 company or a small mom and pop business. And I know, Eugene, you can talk about this more. There's a task force CBP has set up to work with trade. They also have a focus group. And there's also a broader coalition of industry groups who are working on this to try to work with CBP and make certain that this 21 CCF works for U.S. companies, for importers and exports, as well as fulfilling all of Customs goals in making these legislative changes.
Do you all have a sense of timing of when we're going to see a draft of the framework come out?
Well, one of the things that we've been pushing really hard is, as I'm operating within the working group, the task force, the 21 CCF task force and working group, that we're sort of under a non-disclosure agreement. In other words, I have to be very careful what I communicate to my members. And so one of the things we've been advocating for is for CBP to issue feedback prompts, basically provide us with what are some of the issues that they're looking at, and that way it gives us a skeleton and outline that we can then go back to our membership and say, hey, these are the 10 items that CBP is looking at, whether it's advanced data, whether it's entry reform, and then our members can fill in the blank and provide that information back to Customs, because the way everything is set up now, it's very difficult for me to communicate, in a bidirectional way with my membership, as well as in a trial way with CBP to give, create that good feedback loop so they can then create a good product at the end of the day. And so the goal, I would imagine for them is to have something out, a legislative proposals or regulatory proposals next year. But I think a number of things have happened. You have, challenges around, staffing issues at CBP. You have issues around, standing up the advisory committee within Customs COAC, starting a new COAC. So, it's not aligned correctly for them to probably have something out first of next year. So I would predict that it would probably be more of summer, where we would maybe see something, summer of 2022, that we would see some true proposals. But up until then, we definitely want to see them provide us with the feedback loops where we can continue the conversation as they move to finalize some of their regs and some of the legislative proposals.
What do you think the government should do? I mean, I know 21 CCF seems like it's more medium-term, long-term. What do you think the federal government should do to help alleviate some of the current congestion that we're facing? I know that there are, legislative efforts that would give FMC more authority to address alleged anti-competitive conduct in the industry, the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. We interviewed Commissioner Benzel from the FMC earlier this summer, and he seemed to be suggesting that they were a little bit shorthanded at the agency to address all the detention and demurrage issues. So potentially there could be efforts to try to boost their budgets. They could hire additional personnel. What do you think are some things the government could do in the short term?
Well, it's interesting because when I first came on board AAEI a few months ago, I looked at this particular issue and became educated on it. And it reminds me so much of when I worked in the travel industry back in the late 90s, right before 9/11, when it was the issue of passenger rights. The idea, you remember that time, I'm sure, where, passengers were being hit with baggage fees. They were being hit with late fees. They were being hit with change fees, all these fees. And so passengers stood up and they said, well, look, Congress, you've got to do something to make these fees reasonable. We understand that we can't just make changes. We can't bring, enormous, caskets on board the plane. We've got, but they have to be reasonable and they have to be clear on, as far as what those charges are. And I think that's what you're hearing from the industry, is the idea that, that there are these certain charges and we're not sure what the standard charges are. They change from port to port. One person's charges goes up from, $3,000 last year to $20,000 this year. And there's no reasonableness in there. So I think what Congress is attempting to do, being pushed by a number of associations, is to really look at, having the FMC come up with, some sort of minimum standards around the reasonableness of these charges. But more importantly, I think the great thing that I liked about the legislation is that it creates a proactive approach to government for the FMC. In other words, the FMC doesn't have to wait for an investigation to then look into something going on at a port. They can sort of proactively, if there's concern, if they see something, hey, this doesn't make sense, let's investigate this. Because right now, and I think, I was on a call, a week or so ago, they said there weren't any sort of investigations or no complaints listed or filed under some of these issues. And so everyone's complaining, but there were zero filings. So what does that mean? Does that mean that people are afraid to file, or does that mean that there are no issues? But we know there are issues, right? And so maybe the FMC can take a proactive approach if they're given the authority to do so, because my understanding is right now they don't have that proactive authority to go out there and investigate without some kind of investigation being afforded. So there sort of needs, in the same way that we created a passenger bill of rights, maybe there needs to be some sort of shipper's bill of rights that sort of identifies reasonable ways that shippers can be charged. Because at the end of the day, you think about it's sort of like a domino effect. If shippers are being charged these enormous amounts, then it then impacts consumer prices. And then what's interesting is that the ports and the carriers that are charging these fees, it comes back to them when they're trying to order supplies for their ships, as well as pay for their employees. So it's at the end of the day, it's a win-win, I think, to come up with reasonable charges for these for some of these costs.
Right, and so we're talking about detention demurrage fees, but there are other charges out there. For example, the new duties on imported chassis from China. I believe it's 221%. And I know that there are basically three main items that are going to be really important for the supply chain, right? Ships, containers, and chassis. And so I'm wondering, and there have been reports about the unavailability of containers and chassis in certain instances. How do you think those duties will impact supply chain capacity?
Well, Jeff, this really gets back to the point that I was making earlier, that there needs to be a one government approach to everything. So here's how crazy things are in the absence of a one government approach. So you have USTR on commerce basically impose tariffs on Chinese goods. So a lot of the chassis come from there. So then the price of the chassis go up. You then you don't have enough chassis at certain ports, which means you can't get some of the goods moved, which means consumer prices go up. So you have all these different agencies not coordinating, working together, and not realizing when they come out with policy, the other effects that it could have on other parts of the economy. Memphis, I was researching, Memphis is a great example of that. These tariffs, on the chassis are having a huge impact on the movement of goods out of Memphis. So I think there needs to be a one government approach of looking at the supply chain, rather looking at it from just, CBP's part in this, or Commerce part in this, or USTR's part in this. There needs to be a one government approach and saying, if we make this policy, how is it going to impact all the other actors in the supply chain, including those actors that regulate, the parties within the supply chain.
Right. And actually, you mentioned USTR and Commerce, and they've been tagged in various legislative proposals, as well as some of the language from the White House. The White House has created this new strike force on supply chain that they want USTR to lead. It sounds like I was going to ask you about how USTR should approach these things, and I think I know your answer. Whole of government approach.
Yeah, my answer is I want to see a one government approach. I mean, the thing is that USTR, they're a fantastic group. The amount of work that they accomplish, given their size and their small budget is incredible. And Catherine is fantastic, the perfect person to be a USTR rep. But the challenge for them is that they're just working on this small little piece. Commerce is working on this small little piece. And then now, as a result of the way the Biden administration's trade policy is set up, state is pretty much, I would argue, running things. So you have a whole chain. So you have all these these silos, but it definitely needs to be more of a one government approach when we look, because at the end of the day, we're looking at how can the U.S. be competitive globally. We're not looking at how CBP can be, regulate to be competitive, or commerce regulate to be competitive, but we're looking at a whole one government approach of how the U.S. can be competitive, not just with China, but with, emerging markets and all over the globe. That's how our competitors, other countries, they take a one government approach. They look at everything, and how to, increase or improve their economy.
And so how do you think, in terms of that, one government approach, like what's the role of increasing funding? So I know, there's legislation that would give commerce a new office and a lot of funding in the area of supply chain. The infrastructure bill, potentially, I think it's $17 billion for ports. Where should that go? I mean, what's the role of increased funding and increasing the?
Yeah, we're a supporter of the infrastructure bill mainly because supply chains are intermodal. So the idea that if I bring something into a port, whether it's LA or if it's Charleston, wherever it might be, those goods have to move on a road. Those goods have to move on a rail, and eventually from a rail to your car. And so infrastructure is huge. You look at what happened, when I used to work for DHL with the Spence Bridge in Cincinnati. When that bridge shut down, it shut down, a lot of our activity as DHL, and we're an air carrier. So you can imagine we're not even an ocean carrier. So it impacted us. It impacted the truck carriers. It impacted rail. It had an enormous impact because that bridge has been in need of fixing for quite some time. And so it's like that all across the country, whether it's roads, highways, ports. Since we operate in an intermodal environment, there has to be more money, put forward towards, infrastructure in some way. And then to allow the states, because the great thing about this infrastructure bill, it provides the states with the funding to identify places within their state that they can improve, their supply chain infrastructure. And so that's the piece that I think that I would highlight in there. As far as giving funding to commerce, I would rather give more funding to CBP and FDA and some other organizations. One of the things as we're more concerned of what's coming in, we're charging more agencies with authority at the border. CPSC, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, is a great example of this. Okay, CPC has new authority, but they don't have the funds or the manpower to do what they need to do at the border. So that means that they have a small amount of people holding up tons and tons of goods, and we can't get those goods moving. So I would rather see that money going, to agencies that have authority at the border to, improve the velocity of goods coming in and out of the U.S.
Yeah, and actually we just interviewed CPSC, and that'll be coming out soon. And it is amazing the amount of products they regulate. And they have, I believe, essentially a one-person office in China handling everything. And they're making use of all different kinds of tools, online tools in particular, to try to cover the gap that you're talking about. But yeah, it is amazing. Like when you think about how small that agency is with the amount of items that they regulate across the economy, particularly, obviously in the consumer goods area. I also wanted to mention, the supply chain executive order that came out in February, because several agencies, including transportation, have just come out and asked for comments on what they should be doing to try to improve supply chain competitiveness. And so DOT is focusing on, the role of transportation systems in supply chain competitiveness and dealing with the risks to those transportation systems. And I'm wondering, what advice would you give to DOT in terms of their role in this?
Well, I think one of the things we want to do is, in the same way that we stood up a committee to look at the 21 CCF, we're gathering, a group to provide the DOT as well as some of the other agencies that are involved in this supply chain executive order with some of the recommendations. We haven't completed the recommendations as of yet, but we're very excited that they put this, the EO came out. It was one of the things that we've been pushing. I mean, there sort of is a one government approach, although there were some concerns that it was very, focused on a small bucket of different industries. We don't want to, beat up on those industries, but there are other industries, that emerging industries that we feel like that needs to be propped up or supported, through supply chain velocity. So we're going to bring some of those recommendations forward, but we're happy that at least, the Biden administration is looking and saying, okay, we need to figure out how to create even if it's a study group or, advisory committee or whatever it might be, coming up with a one government approach to address some of the transportation as well as supply chain issues.
The last thing I wanted to chat about was China trade policy. And I know that AAEI recently signed an industry letter urging the administration to restart the trade talks with China and improve the tariff exclusion process. And I'm wondering whether you could talk a bit about the U.S.-China trade tensions and how those have impacted your members.
Yeah, so of course the tariffs has had an enormous impact, but just if you're doing business there, it's just the bad blood or bad relationship between the two countries is creating a lot of tension as companies look to either expand their business there or look to go into China. And I think the Biden administration is in a tough position. They're almost in a position that the Trump administration was in, and I won't sit here and pretend like I'm a China expert like Craig Allen, but I do think that the Biden administration needs to determine they need to determine whether they view China as a military adversary or whether they view them as an economic competitor. And so there's two different ways or strategies to approach each one. If you view them as an economic competitor, then it's our products and services versus your products and services. How do I build up my products and services to compete against you? But if you view me as a military adversary, then I have to take a step back. I have to decouple. I have to worry about security concerns. I have to worry about who's doing business there. And I think the administration isn't, they're going through this review, and I think that's what they're trying to figure out. What is China? Is their military adversary or economic competitor? And I think China's looking and they're saying, well, wait a minute, we have common prosperity. We have concerns of the West. They may be taking more of a military, adversary approach in the sense that they're taking over Hong Kong. So they're taking a different approach. But the Biden administration really needs to look at that. And I think that the other thing they need to do is I really feel like that they need to take a reset. I think if you look at what happened with COVID has accelerated time 5 years. In other words, when I say that is that, COVID it's been 18 months, but in reality, whether it's orders, contracting, business decisions, strategies, it's really 5 years have been taken off a lot of companies' planning. So if you're sitting there and looking at what happened with the tariffs, the decisions to have the phase deal and all of that, the world is totally different now than it was, when the Trump administration took that approach. Although they've made some advances, in IPR and technology transfer and some state-owned enterprise issues, it's a different world now. And so I think the Biden administration is now, they have to figure out, do we attach ourselves to this other framework, which is the only existing dialogue for the two countries to speak on, or do we create something new? And I think they definitely need to create a new product and process. They basically I feel like they need to come out and say, okay, let's have a reset. The tariffs haven't worked. Let's have a reset. Let's put a pause. Let's come up with a new product, a new dialogue, a new process to address the specific issues that we have concerns about today, because it's a different world. It's not the same world that, existed in Trump with inflation and, all the political instability, supply chain disruptions. It's a totally different world. So I think a reset is needed to really help us move forward.
Yeah, those are great points about the 5 years lost due to the pandemic. Stephanie, I know you participate in the AAEI Trade Policy Committee discussions. What are members in the Trade Policy Committee talking about with respect to U.S.-China issues?
I think, at a broad level, one of the issues you hear a lot about is just how much uncertainty there is currently. With the exclusion process on hold, obviously forced labor is a concern for this administration and how that will end up being implemented or they're addressed by this administration. The China review still ongoing. And I think for a lot of companies, this uncertainty means they don't quite know what they should do with their supply chains at this moment. Obviously there's, for a brief period of time, the investigation into Vietnam where a lot of companies had gone to in an effort to avoid using China as part of their supply chain. And that investigation, although now suspended, made a lot of companies uncertain as to whether or not what their alternatives were. And I think what you hear in all these meetings is a lot about how this costs companies a lot of money to adjust, to try to react with this uncertainty, not knowing exactly what will happen how they should adjust. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of resources. Companies can't change their supply chains instantly, right? It requires a lot of research as to what makes sense for a company. And as a result, this uncertainty is, I think, making a lot of these companies worried, concerned about their financial ability to respond, essentially, to U.S.-China tensions.
Yeah, and as you were talking about the Vietnam investigation, I kept hearing Eugene's words. I could see them flashing before my eyes. One government approach, right? Because you're trying to move the supply chains, but then the place that they would be most likely to go, you create that uncertainty. And so, where do you want them to go? And so, that's an issue for the interagency process. And it definitely seems like there's much more of a robust interagency process now than there was a couple of years ago. So I think that's helpful. Stephanie, you mentioned forced labor, and I'm wondering, what obviously there's a lot going on in this area with the WROs, and I'm wondering, where AAEI is with respect to how the administration should approach that issue.
I know AAEI has started a subcommittee on this topic. I think Eugene can probably talk a bit more about that. And I know a lot of the members are, I think, pushing for transparency about the WR process and what that means. I know AAEI has also had CBP officials talking about the process and changes that they may make. But I think what we've been hearing a lot of is just needing more visibility about it and how the WR process proceeds, how companies are able to show that they aren't using forced labor. I think right now it's all fairly opaque. The timing of the process is often up in the air, though Eugene might be able to talk about that more. And that's another area of uncertainty for companies as they try to figure out how to avoid forced labor and how to show that they aren't using it.
Yeah, I think if you compare it, I always like to compare the forced labor issue to some of the other issues where the trade has worked with, CBP to sort of address it, whether it's terrorism or whether it's counterfeiting. In the case of terrorism and counterfeiting, even in the presence of law enforcement investigations, CBP has figured out a way to include the trade prior to any concerns that they had. So they trade and CBP would figure out a way, under NDAs or under some kind of regime to work together to identify where there is a concern. We have a concern that there might be a potential terrorist activity here in Yemen, or we might be concerned that there's counterfeit, in Saudi Arabia, wherever. And they've worked together, even when it's been a law enforcement procedure. So the idea that you can't inform or include the trade in any concern you have with forced labor, I just don't understand that. And that's the part that our members are most concerned. They want Stephanie hit it's the transparency part. If as a trader, if the government has a concern about a particular area, you need to tell me about it beforehand, before I have my business grow there or before whatever happens. But it's almost like now it's gotcha. It's like, this place is bad, and then they come back and come after us. And then the trader's in a position that they don't even know what documentation or evidence they need to put forward in order to prove that their supply chain is clean. So at the end of the day, AEI members, they want a clean supply chain. They don't want forced labor, particularly in this world that we live with social media and everything that can come out if you are doing business in those type of environments. So they want to do the right thing. But if you're not providing them with the information that they need to get out of those places, before the punishments happen. I mean, in every other sphere, whether it's counterfeit or terrorism or even, traditional crimes, CBP has figured out a way to work with the trade in prior to, formal investigations to address the issue. And that's not the case with forced labor, and that's what we're most concerned about.
So it sounds like there are a lot of common solutions to these issues in terms of internal coordination, a reset on a lot of these issues, and also, improving transparency and working with the trades to make sure that expertise is built into into the process. Thanks so much, Eugene. Really appreciate your coming on the program, and really interesting discussion, and looking forward to keeping in touch as the supply chain issues continue to heat up and evolve.
And thank you for inviting me. And we're going to continue our conversation next year in Fort Lauderdale. We're celebrating our 100th anniversary, so
wow.
June 13th through the 15th. So we're looking forward to having Stephanie lead the issues of forced labor in 21 CCF, and of course have you, Jeff, to speak on all the issues that you're working on. So thank you again for having AEI on.
Thanks again, Eugene, and really appreciate it. And thanks also to Stephanie for joining us to talk about the important work she's doing. I know she's had a fantastic experience with AAEI, and so again, thanks for joining us.
Yes, thank you. And I would just like to add, for AAEI is a great resource for companies hoping to engage on these issues, particularly on topics like 21 CCF. Industry groups are talking with customs regularly. I know Eugene's involved in all the discussions of 21 CCF. And for lots of companies who don't have the ability or connections to make their views known, I think industry groups like AAEI are very important for their ability to make certain they are able to affect policy changes.
Awesome. Well said, and look forward to next June, and we'll certainly be in touch in the meantime. So that's it for this edition of Supply Chain University. Thanks everyone for joining us. You can find this in all of our videos at steptoe.com. And you can also find us on YouTube, where you can like and subscribe. See you next time, everybody.